Hi everyone, I'm Mitchum Turner and welcome back to the Big Rig Compliance YouTube channel. For those who don't know me, I'm a NHVR auditor, WA auditor and general heavy vehicle auditor consultant. Today we're going to be looking at false or misleading records specifically in the work diary, and this tutorial is really targeted at drivers talking about work diaries and issues and common things that I see. Let's get into it. The first image we have up in front of us is straight from the front of the National Work Diary. It tells us here that it's against the law for us to make statements or record information that we know or that we should know is false or misleading. So, false is untrue, misleading is where the information may be unclear or it may make people make assumptions that are incorrect. We'll show some examples later on of what that is. The second slide that we have here is straight from the work diary as well. If we look at the fourth dot point down, it tells us that we have to make sure that our writing is clear, accurate, and able to be understood by another person. So this is also going to come into misleading in some of the examples we show later on. Heavy vehicle national law, false and misleading records. First things first, we're going to look at section 702 of the law, and this tells us that it's an offence or illegal, we can call it, to provide a false or misleading record to an official. Now, an official might be police and national heavy vehicle regulator or an authorised person. Section 703 tells us that it's an offence to provide a false or misleading document or information to another responsible person. So a responsible person is what heavy vehicle law calls somebody that it's in the chain of responsibility. For most of our examples, this is going to be your employer or the person that keeps your work diary records, which the regulator and heavy vehicle law refer to as the record keeper. We're just going to call it your employer. So it also might include consigners, contracting companies, an auditor, anyone that you're providing a false record to. Now in front of us, we have a work diary page that I've fabricated to show us a couple of examples of false and of misleading records. So the first thing we need to know is that the driver in this scenario is required to go and load his own trailer, and we've got him starting work in Laverton. The driver is also required to do a pre-trip inspection of his vehicle and trailers. And we're not going to talk about his delivery location today. So, having a look at the example, I'm just going to pause it and I'm going to let everybody have a think about what areas might be false or what might be misleading. And remember again, in this example, the driver has to load their own trailers or to go to a depot and have that forklift load or be engaged in the loading process in some way. And the driver does have to do a pre-trip inspection of the vehicle. And that load is going to occur at the beginning of the day around Laverton area. For the first example, we can see that the drivers recorded the optional time of daily check. Remember, this is optional. This does not need to be completed in your work diary. They've completed the daily check at 6:30 a.m. But if we look at the work in the work rest section, we say that we don't begin work until 7 a.m. Now, this might be a genuine error, it might be accidental, it might be misleading, or it might be falsification. So, this is potentially falsification in that it is deliberate omission or deliberately leaving out or not showing work that has been completed. We're going to jump quickly to the definition of work in heavy vehicle national law. So this is the definition of work from heavy vehicle national law. So work is not just driving, it's also all of the other non-driving tasks related to being in a fatigue heavy vehicle. If we look at point 2II here under C, we say that inspecting the vehicle can be considered work. So doing your pre-trip inspection at 6:30 a.m. should be recorded as work. It's a requirement of law to record it as work in your work diary. We're also going to say here, which will be relevant for our next point, under section 8 VIII, it says recording information or completing a document is also considered work. Now, what is work's pretty complex. This is a whole other video for another time, but I'll just direct your attention to point D there. A lot of people think that what is work and what is rest is a grey area, so to speak, but it's very much black and white because it has to be a concept defined by law. And we get it right down to the point of if you're in the driver's seat while the vehicle is running, you are working. In example 1, we established that the driver has told us they're working at 6:30 a.m., undertaking their daily check. We also know that the driver has done some pre-start loading activities, be that connecting trailers, securing loads, maybe reversing into a dock, whatever it might be. We've got some work time, which is not driving. If we look at the work diary here between 7 a.m. and 10:15 a.m., we can see that the driver has told us they've done 311 kilometres, and we can see about 3.25, maybe 3.5 hours. So our second example of misleading records is the line is not drawn straight in between 10:15 and 10:30. So looking at this record, we don't know whether it's work or whether it's rest. This might be deliberately misleading or accidental. Squiggly lines, lines that aren't straight, lines that are in the middle can be seen as misleading records. Now, if we count up all of the different work done, if we include that 10:15 to 10:30 as work, then we get the 9 hours total. So we're going to assume that it's work. So we've got 3.5 hours work here, and we know the driver's done some load unload activity, and we know the driver's done a pre-start check. So the question here is, in between Laverton, which is suburban Melbourne, and Barnawartha, which is Logic Centre up near Albury Wodonga, can we do 311 kilometres in 3.5 hours work, plus all of the other non-driving activity? Well, we probably can't, because a pre-trip inspection will take up time, as will a load unload, and we also know that the driver was working earlier in the day. So we can say here with some certainty that this is a false record, and we would be able to back this up by looking for information such as GPS. If the truck hasn't got GPS fitted, we might look at cameras at the depot. We might look at sign in, sign out times. We might look at consignment notes that have got times on them. Maybe there was some fueling at the depot. We can look at e-tags. We can look at a lot of information to identify whether that's correct. We might not have all of that access to information as employers or as drivers, but the police and the enforcement personnel will have access to that information and can request it. In example 3, we have what's called a distance over time breach. So we know that trucks are speed limited to 100 kilometres an hour. And we also know that if they roll off a hill and if they do speed, say for example, go to 110 kilometres an hour downhill, They also had to get up the hill, which would have been slowing down. We also know that in the work diary, every minute you work must be rounded up, or every second that you work, or every period must be rounded up to the nearest 15 minutes. So if you do 16 minutes of work, then you must record it as half an hour in the work diary. So if we look at this example here from 11 a.m. until 2:45 p.m., that is 3 hours and 45 minutes work. If we take the assumption that the truck can travel 100 kilometers an hour for every single second of that period, so what this means is that the truck never gets stuck behind slow traffic. It never has to go up a hill and slow down. It doesn't have to go through speed zones under 100 kilometers. And from the second that the ignition is turned and the driver pulls out on the road, they're already doing 100 kilometers an hour, which means they don't have to speed up and they don't have to slow down because they're doing 100 kilometers an hour for every single second of this 3 hours, 45 minutes. If we work on that assumption, the truck can only do 375 kilometers in 3.75 hours. Now, we know obviously that that's absurd. You can't have an average speed of 100k an hour unless you're breaking the law, be that not showing all of your work by rounding down your work or omitting work, or your truck isn't speed limited, or you're rolling the vehicle off the hills. For some reason, we're either not showing all of our work in the work diary or we're speeding. Neither one of these are good. So in this example, if we look at the kilometers at about 10-ish, and then if we look at them at about 3-ish in the work diary, we can see 100,311. And then 3.75 of an hour later, we can see 100,691 kilometers. Now, again, if we do 100k an hour for every single second of that period, we can only do a maximum of 375k. Here, we have the truck doing 380 kilometers in that period. So the average speed is over 100 kilometers. Basically, we know that this can't be correct, and we know that it indicates a breach. This is a conversation I've had many, many, many times with drivers, with schedulers, with company owners. People say, what if the odometer's out? What if, it goes over 100 downhill? My truck can average 100 kilometers an hour because it's speed limited to 100. People forget to take into account the speeding up, the slowing down, the traffic, slowing down up hills, all of that. I use this extreme example of over 100k an hour average speed because it's not debatable. If we had access to GPS records and we looked at this, we'd be able to show over 3.75 of an hour worked. If your odometer is that far out, it's a requirement of law that it's made accurate. So in the situations that I've seen, that isn't the case. And also this example that I've used kilometre readings off of Google Maps, which are going to be accurate or accurate enough. We're not going to be 5-10% out enough to throw that this would be an inaccurate record. So again, 11 a.m. until about 2:45 p.m. here. This breach is called a distance over time breach. And what we're saying is that there is not enough time shown in the work diary for the work to have been legally completed. This is a breach that's considered falsification, and it is one that's very common and that we come across frequently. Keep an eye out for it in short work periods, going down highways. Keep an eye out for it when in the last shift of the day when drivers are running out of hours, maybe their total work hours shown are 12, and the last shift of the day is very brief. They're the periods that we frequently see it. In some cases, you'll see it absolutely everywhere. All right, for the final example, we're going to tie all of this together and we're going to show the big alarm bell that tells me this page has a breach. After this, please stick around. I'm going to have a little shameless self plug on an electronic work diary sale. And we're also going to talk about things that parties in the chain of responsibility, so for example, employers, should be doing to make sure that they're covering their responsibilities. And we're also going to talk about things that, as a driver, you need to be aware of if you do choose to make these false entries. Okay, let's look at this work diary page as an entire page, and let me put my auditor hat on and share with you what I see, which potentially is also what police or regulator or somebody else that's reviewing this work diary might see. First things first, we've got 9 work hours. We've gone through and we've looked at that little time from 10:15 to 10:30, and we've said that we think it's work because if we count it as work, we get the 9. Overall, we've got a very short period of work to get from Melbourne to get into southern Sydney. If we look at the daily check, we know that not all work is recorded, and we know that the driver started at 6:30 a.m. Then, if we look at the kilometres, and you'll see that I've circled the beginning and the end of the day, we have, I've kept it simple, 845 kilometres in 9 hours work. Now, 845 kilometres in 9 hours may immediately seem to you achievable because it's under 100 kilometres an hour. But the things we've talked about are really important. We need to add in the pre-trip inspection, and that's going to take time. We need to add in creating a record, which is creating this logbook record, and that will take time as well. We have to add in some form of loading time because we've said that in this example, the driver is loading as well. And we have to acknowledge that there are speed zones that are under 80, 100 kilometres an hour. Now, I'm not super familiar myself personally with New South Wales, but I know up around the Logic Centre, Barnawartha, Benalla, there are zones that go down to under 100k an hour. I also know that in Melbourne, before we get onto the ring road, there are lower speed zones and there are often fluctuating speeds. We also have on ramps getting out of the depot, slowing down to get in and out of truck stops, speeding up, and hopefully we're not speeding over 100 kilometres an hour to make up for the times that we're under 100k an hour. So if we look at this and we've done 9 hours work in 845 kilometres, we can look at it and we generally know that there isn't enough work hours shown on this work diary page to cover the work that we know is being done. So if you're an employer, you're probably thinking, how on earth am I going to protect myself from false and misleading entries? The first step is we need to be reviewing our documents and we need to take steps to make sure that we are identifying the problems and preventing them. So we need to be reviewing our work diaries for false and misleading records. How do we review them? Well, the NHVR tells us in the BFM matrices, which is the auditor information, that we should be checking work diaries against things like schedules, GPS tracking data, and other monitoring systems. If we go look at WA, they refer us back to a safety alert from 2009. And that safety alert talks about things like gate logs, so client information about when the vehicle left the loadings and unloading sites, fuel dockets, fuel cards, phone records, mobile telephone records, and loading documentation. Realistically, GPS has come a very long way, and GPS is what would be expected as a minimum. Now, going back to the regulator information about how to avoid liability, if we do find a problem, we need to deal with it. We need to ensure that a note is made that we know about this. And remember, we need to prevent the employees from providing this information. So, what we need to do is we need to raise a non-conformance internally, document what we found, and we then need to take steps to prevent it happening again in future. And to prevent it happening again in future, we have to look at the root cause and we have to take appropriate action. So that might be allowing more time in rosters if the motivation for the false record was that the driver was running out of time. It might be re-educating the driver if the driver wasn't aware of the definition of work and that things like a pre-trip inspection of work. And we need to continue to monitor to make sure that those preventative actions we've taken have worked. So coming to the end, I just want to make a note for the drivers, which I would make if I was providing this training to in person. You need to be aware that your employer is required by law to provide any documentation like GPS records and work diaries that the police request, or enforcement personnel or NHVR representatives. It may not be yourself that does something wrong that brings your employer or your record keeper to the attention of the regulator. It might even just be a spot check. You need to know that if your vehicle's got GPS, that the GPS records, in my experience, are not deleted after 6 months or a year. They are kept for a very long time, if not indefinitely. You also need to know that the GPS will show every time the ignition's turned on and off. And in intervals of a matter of seconds, it will show how fast the vehicle's going and the geographic location and whether the vehicle's moving. So in our example, we talk about a pre-trip inspection. The GPS would show the ignition turning on and off. We talk about load-unload activity. The GPS would show that vehicle shunting around the depot. We know that load activity in our example was done in Laverton, and this might be local or in the driver's base area. In my experience, the regulators and the investigators would be looking for local records to see who was doing the load. So we can't say that another driver is doing that load activity if you are, especially if you're being paid for it or your timesheet shows more work than your work diary. Looking at the rest periods, we say here that we've done 845 kilometres in 9 hours. The GPS would show every minute, every second that you're working, and it would show the speed and it would show where you are. We can log on and we can check where exactly you were and when you arrived at some of these sites. On top of the GPS, we've got speed cameras and point-to-point cameras. You'll have phone records. Now, remember that taking a phone call related to work is work. It needs to be in the work diary. We will have consignment notes that might have times attached to them. When these investigations are being done, we've had enforcement personnel contacting the loading sites and contacting the consigners. And the consigner reaction is normally fear that they might in some way be responsible, and they hand over as much information as they can, which in my experience again will include time in, time out, camera footage, everything they've got. So be aware that if you have a false or misleading record in your diary, that it's very easy for the enforcement personnel to find the information to prove that it's wrong. And this false and misleading, it's not a fine, it is a court case every time. And we don't want you caught up in that or getting in trouble. So my experience with false and misleading records is generally that the reason behind it is either the driver making the false record doesn't understand exactly what tasks would be considered as work legally, or there isn't enough time in the schedule, or sometimes there's enough time, but the driver is concerned that they will run out of time, so they will habitually not record waiting time or load unload time, or perhaps they will round their work down instead of up, which is the legal requirement that it's rounded up. So 1 minute of work might be recorded as rest instead of 15 minutes of work. I can help with training in companies about this. We can help with safety management systems. I also have access to an electronic work diary. I get approached by a lot of companies. This particular one I've found to be driver oriented. The creators came out of experiences with Uber gig related driving. So the software is really oriented at being easy for drivers to use. And what we've found is the electronic work diary allows drivers to record their work instead of doing 1 minute work and recording that as 15 minutes in the work diary. That work can be recorded as 1 minute in the electronic work diary. So we've had some feedback that this provides drivers with a lot more time. They're not losing time in their diary to rounding up. If this is something that you want to try, I can provide free trials. It's $110 per year per driver. So if you're working full time as a long distance driver, it's actually cheaper than getting paperwork diaries now. It's a fantastic service, no obligation, free trial. Give me a hit up if you want to talk about this or training or safety management systems, or perhaps basic fatigue management, BFM, to get a few more hours up the sleeve in the day for the drivers. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry this has been a long one, but it's very detailed. I hope it will be of use to you all. Please share far and wide. Please subscribe. Please press the notification button on YouTube or follow me on Facebook, Big Rig Compliance. Thank you again for watching. And I look forward to doing a lot more of these free videos in the future. If there's any topics that you would like to see addressed, or any questions or any follow-up questions or examples you've got, please contact me, Mitchum Turner, at outlook.com.au. Thank you. Ciao.